2024 was a weird year in Netrunner. It was one of the biggest years of Netrunner during NSG's tenure, and it was a year with dozens of viable decks. But unlike my video recapping the Automata Initiative meta, this is a meta I have much more mixed feelings about. It's a paradoxical year where Corp win rates were generally high, at least hovering between 50 and 60%, but at no point in the year do I think that Corps were actually stronger than runners, and this manifested in some pretty warped and unpleasant at times metagames. Last time in the Automata Initiative recap video, I ended up with discussing the CBI and Man the Moon Last Chance qualifier. While I was doing that immediately after those events without the benefit of knowing what happened next. And coming off the highly varied metas of Worlds 23 and the other tailing events of the year, we started seeing that Mulch was becoming dominant in the meta. At the time when I made the Automata Initiative recap, I said it was unclear if Mulch was the best deck. But within a few weeks, it was pretty clear that it was the definitive best deck in the format. Mulch was a deck initially developed by Querying the Message, also known as QTM. The central idea was to use a synergistic virus core supported by Cookbook and Knobkery to control the Corp's game plan. The deck leveraged Audrey V2, a new card from the Automata Initiative, as an early to mid-game breaker to allow the deck to spend more of its early resources on setup. Card draw was powered by the Lago Peronia Shelter, along with Hoshiko's ability, allowing the deck to quickly find its key pieces and set up a very strong end-game board state. These decks had historically struggled to apply early pressure in the early turns, but between Banhar and Audrey, Corp defenses had to be extremely robust to withstand the early aggression of the deck. And after QTM debuted the deck, others began to tinker with it, and it quickly became a staple of the meta. A notable variant switched the identity to Lu, which made the deck more all-in on Imp, trashing key pieces, where the Imp went from a 1x to a 3x in the deck and dropping to the Banhar because of the compressed card slots. Both versions were popular with slightly different testing groups and players, but it was pretty clear that the core of the deck, an infinite Knobkery virus engine, was the strongest thing you could be doing on the runner side. Corps scrambled to try and figure out a solution to the deck, but due to the toolbox as well as heavily disruptive nature of the deck, it was hard to find a single silver bullet. Some Corps tried to outspeed the deck, like Yodel PDs, which will get more discussion later, while others tried to go for more kill combos, like the punitive Counter-Strike Jinteki decks. These decks often played out of Restoring Humanity, though sometimes Ag Infusion, rely on bacterial programming, along with your digital life to create large credit and tempo swings, and use those to land punitive Counter-Strikes. The other threat of the deck was often to use Regenesis to score the agendas discarded in archives, so the runner was forced to interact early and often with frequent opportunities for them to misplay and misunderstand the amount of pressure they were under. Another deck that was in consideration was an asset version of Reality Plus, relying on the mainstays of AR Enhanced Security and Amani Sinai. This deck would have many different permutations throughout the year, but the core idea was that the economic advantage of Reality Plus, combined with the new asset tools from the Automata Initiative, gave the deck a lot of power that it could use to navigate the early game. The Last Chance qualifier, held the week before the Circuit Breaker Invitational, was a widely attended event. Over half the overall field was Anarch, with almost all of that split between Hoshiko and Lu. Lat was the next most present runner. On the Corp side, Precision Design, the Panic mainstay, and the most reg Corp that was thought to have game into Mulch, made up a whole quarter of the field, with Reality Plus and Ob both making up 17 and 11% of the field. Krim actually made a very strong showing despite being low overall numbers of attendance, placing 3 players in the top 8, with 2 of them making the top 4. These were very reg decks, making money and sniping agendas, likely as a counterforce to the expected high amount of PD that they were rewarded for calling. Everyone who brought PD was well rewarded. Even at 25% of the field, it outperformed and made up 55% of the top cut. Similarly, Mulch variants pushed out just about any other Anarch deck, and Shaper did not make the top 8 at all. The following weekend, a very similar story emerged, with 50% of the top runners being on Mulch, but we had some more variety, with 1 Essa, 2 Reg Hoshikos, and a Lat also making the top cut. The Corp side changed a lot, with no Precision Design making the top 8. More Glacier decks started to make waves, with Ag Infusion and some Glacier Asmarilis sneaking in there as well. The event was won by Yantuno playing Mulch, as well as a damage-focused Ob deck that looked to grind out long games and deplete the runner's resources. What was pretty clear after the Circuit Breaker Invitational was that though you could play non-mulch decks on the runner side, it was probably worth learning the deck. The deck was so powerful and so flexible that it was hard to justify playing anything else. The corpse side was more open, but the top cut was still dominated by decks that looked to damage the runner, trying to tax cards in hand more so than credits, as Mulch's economy was very different from standard runner economies. The season then hit a little bit of a lull between the Circuit Breaker Invitational and the release of Rebellion Without Rehearsal, with a few smaller events, but nothing that seemed to shake up the meta. With the release of Rebellion Without Rehearsal, though, things would start to change. Rebellion Without Rehearsal was a standard set release where it completed the other half of the Automata initiative. Most of the strong runner cards were Shaper, which was a faction that had been out of the meta since Endurance was banned over a year prior. And even though Shaper had gotten a lot of power, it wasn't clear immediately what to do with their cards. Lobosome would become a staple for kit decks out of the box, and the deck would see a lot of development and Spark of Inspiration center decks, which we'll discuss more later. Trickshot was thought to be a strong card, but how pivotal it would be in boosting the power of Shaper in the upcoming season was not yet clear. The set did provide Corpse some new angles of attack. The most discussed card of the pack was Hollow Man, a card that seemed like it could fit in basically any archetype. The card enabled the scoring of 5/3s without having to advance on the prior turn. It can be used to score 3/2s out of hand, and because the card could move, it could also have a home in horizontal decks and glacier decks. Another big player in the RWR release set was Tributary, a 3-influence Techie Ice that had the ability to move every turn, adding a huge barrier to run-based engines as they had to clear the hurdle of Tributary, which could go in just about any Corp deck. The first few events saw a lot of experimentations on both sides as people tried out their new toys. There were 3 particular large events which highlighted the diversity of Corp strategies as well as the increasing homogeneity of the runner side. And the NPC Vancouver was the first large event of the RWR competitive season, and a pretty diverse cut on the Corp side, but Anarch decks made up 5 of the top 8, though not all of them were Mulch. All 3 of the top 3 Corp decks were centered around one of the new power cards from Rebellion Without Rehearsal. Man of the Moon's R+ deck was using the Hollow Man to threaten scores that used to require seamless launch, but now could spend the influence in other places. Sid 7 came in second with a suite of Rebellion Without Rehearsals, including Tributary and Cohort Guidance Program, both of which allowed the deck to significantly accelerate and provide value behind small amounts of ice. The third place deck was a Glacier Ag Infusion deck, which used Tributary along with Charlotte Cassador to create disproportionately impactful early remotes and pivot into larger and more impactful ice. The runner side was a mix of Mulch, Reg, Anarch, as well as Essa and Spark Kit, making the top 8. I haven't talked about Reg Anarch much, and I'm not going to talk about it too much in detail in this event. The deck has been a bit of a ship of Theseus, being almost entirely different cards from its 2017 kind of origins, but still the same idea of orange cards are busted, and just grinding out high-value cards for small edges against the Corp. Hoshiko has been the face of Reg Anarch ever since the rotation of Order and Chaos, in particular Valencia, and the versions here, which became known as Ashiniko, were generally combining the early game pressure of Banhart with the Turbine Cleaver Buzzsaw Echelon Breaker suite to win late games against Glacier, and then spending a lot of influence and slots on asset tech cards like Wheels and Miss Bones. The only win condition these decks typically packed was Ma, which allowed the deck to also disrupt combo corps. This deck was generally considered to be just behind the Mulch and the Lu decks, while still clearly better than any other runner option that was well known at the time. And the additions of the Price and Ashen Epilogue allowed the deck to set up both faster and then also, in theory, grind out for longer board games. The deck, with the addition of the Price, the deck became infamous for sometimes having the complete rig assembled between turns 4 and 6, making Corps feel like they had almost no hope in those situations. The March and both April AMTs show that while there were a lot of different things people were trying, the strongest decks were coalescing. Confusion was putting up consistently good results, and NB and asset decks were similarly posing some significant challenges to runners. The Ashiniko decks also continued to put up strong results, as they were, I would say, easier to pilot than many of the Mulch decks, while still coming close in power level. The Toronto NA NPC event was won by a combo OB that used the Hollow Man to advance Reconstruction Contract and then kill the runner with Clearinghouse. I'm not going to go into detail on the interaction here, just calling this out as this would eventually get hit by a ban in the near future. The online Summer Showdown was the final event before the next ban list, and the largest event of the of the period by a significant margin. 72 players attended and battled it out over 2 days of Netrunner. 72 players attended, and 3 of the top 8 of this event ended up being Mulch, and then 3 of the 8 also ended up being Arasana decks, an idea that had been receiving a ton of attention and fanfare, but had just not shown up at large events in these numbers. Reality Plus, though, is the big story coming out of the online Summer Showdown, cleaning up the top cut, accounting for half of the event, despite making up only an eighth of the field. These were just starting to move away from Hollow Man and use some of the more asset spam tools that had been released in Rebellion Without Rehearsal. Not that they didn't include Hollow Man, it just wasn't the only part of their strategy. A particular note, the combination of warm reception working prototype, along with NBN's kind of tempo control tools, allowed them to score behind pretty minimal ice that was usually tempo positive because of Reality Plus's ability. But the Banlist team had acted based on the events we had seen so far this season, and so while the Summer Showdown happened with the old Banlist Impact, it was known at the time of the event, and 4 cards got banned in the 2405 ban list. Tributary was banned, with the team alluding it just being a too strong card overall, and basically taking Criminal out of the meta, which had been a faction that had performed at least sometimes quite well prior to the release of Tributary. Reconstruction got contract got banned because of the OB combo, and then the Knobkery got banned. This to me was the most impactful ban of this ban list. The Mulch deck's ability to quickly reset their board state and turn a single successful run into a snowball kind of control over the whole board was just too much for almost all corps to handle. Now, having seen how strong NBN had been doing throughout the season, the Balance team decided to take a hit at NBN. They decided to go after Bologna. This card had been basically an automatic 3 of in every NBN deck for the last several years. The card basically created an economic bar where the runner deck had to be able to access cards with 5 to 10 credits throughout the course of a game to even try and make a win, and the additional aggressive asset spamming tools made it more consistent for NBN to have some of these anti-tempo tools like Amani Sinai and Self-Growth Program. The Banlist team also felt like the Hollow Man and other cards from Rebellion Without Rehearsal gave NBN some more legs, and wanted to see how the faction could do without Bologna, as it was clearly the best-in-class card in the entire faction. A notable absence from the ban list is any cards from Reg Hoshiko. The deck had last received a nerf in the previous year with the ban of DreamNet, but has basically remained as the best or one of the second best deck in the format the entire time. Post ban list at NANPC Boston, the ban list could be seen immediately. Lu just disappeared from the runner pie entirely, but Hoshiko barely took a hit, going from 23% of the field to 35% of the field. So basically all of the Lu players turned back into Hoshiko for NANPC Boston, and Hoshiko converted from 35% of the field up to 50% of the cut, showing that it was probably still the strongest deck in the meta. While OB would be the most popular corp at NANPC Boston, only a single one would make it into the top cut, with Sports Metal and Thule being the big converters overall. This Thule deck, known as Santa's Barf Thule, used a variety of click denial tools combined with the Thule ID ability, enable the corp to set these very complex board states that could often kill runners who were unprepared. This deck, in his write-up, Santa Identify, was not enabled by new cards in Rebellion Without Rehearsal, but because the Knobkery ban enabled it to now remove an unwinnable matchup from the board. This is a deck that was not played by that many people, but was a large topic of conversation and would consistently show up near the top of many events. And Restoring Humanity Punitive Counterstrike also made a splash here, though did not make it too far in the event. A week later, the 2024 Continental season started, and we saw Anarch just take over and be half of the overall field, with Hoshiko again making up 37%, a little bit higher than the 35% she had made up at NANPC Boston. Arasana did show up as the most popular shaper. Corpse side was a significant mix, with the top 3 corps, Sports Metal, Ob, and Mari, only combining to a total of 40% of the field. This means that basically no one had a clear idea on what to do on the corpse side into the seemingly oppressive power of Hoshiko. The top cut, however, did not pan out the way that people expected it to. Hoshiko, despite making up almost 40% of the overall field, only made 2 of the top 16 slots in the event. In her place, Arasana cleaned up, taking up 3 slots with 2 lats and a kit deck taking another 3 to give Shaper half of the slots in the cut. The Bologna ban and some more time with the Rebellion Without Rehearsal cards allowed Shapers to discover how powerful their card pool was and would put them in the driver's seat that they would stay in throughout the rest of 2025. All 3 of the Shaper decks in the top 16 would have long-standing impacts on the meta, so we're going to touch on them here. Spark Kit. This deck shell had kind of shown up at UK Nationals in 23 as Grug Kit, but Lobosome, released in Rebellion Without Rehearsal, gave the deck a lot of options to streamline down into more efficient cards and lean more into Spark of Inspiration. The deck usually dropped down to just 2 programs and then this plethora of value events. The most notable addition, of course, was Trick Shot, which allowed the deck to turn a single run into multi-access as well as remote pressure. Normally for kit decks, because of the first time per turn limitation, it would be somewhat less synergistic, but Lobosome and Orca generally meant that the deck had hyper efficient breakers, and Lobosome would not really run out of power counters to break barriers in most board states. This deck would remain popular throughout the year and continues to be popular even now in 2025. However, this deck I think is one of the most overplayed decks relative to its tournament performance. Have one notable finish this year and tends to convert into the cut worse than any other Shaper deck and below its attendance in most events. This could be due to it being a deck that is favored by less experienced players, but I think it also has more to do with the deck's fundamental strength and constructions and how they have not lined up well with what corps are doing to remain powerful. Reglat was another Shaper deck that was piloted to 3rd by Sokka. It would in a few months come to be the deck to beat in the format. The core strength of the Shaper card pool, in particular the Anacam and Lat enabling 2 free draws per turn, along with efficient breakers backed up by Turbine, along with Trick Shot, made it very difficult for corps to not just bleed agendas out of centrals while still being hammered with pressure on R&D. One thing that made these Latless stand out from older ones was its willingness to use non-standard breakers, with Pelongi and Revolver being a common pair used to apply cost-efficient early-game pressure. This deck would develop in a bunch of different directions throughout the year, which we'll talk more about later as this becomes the deck of the meta for quite a while. This winning version used only Revolver and then kind of standard fixed breakers, but by the end of the season, all the breakers will end up being limited use or breakers with significant trade-offs. But Reglat would not take his later year dominance throne just yet. World Tree Arasana. This deck undeniably made the most buzz out of the event. It was a 65 plus card runner deck. Now historically, that's usually a sign of a janky deck where people can't decide which cards to cut, but World Tree had finally found a home now that NBN had hit a setback with the Bologna ban. This deck revolved around World Tree, using it to generate consistent value on central servers and tutor solutions to every corp threat in the meta. The deck was highly technical to pilot, with many one-of tools requiring knowledge of both the deck and most matchups. However, it was clear this deck, if given a few turns to set up, was nearly untouchable. The deck had shown up at NANPC Boston, though it missed the cut. The TIA Breakers were the team that brought it and fully committed to it, and every TIA Breaker member who played it placed in the top 20 of the event. On the corp side, they were scrambling to figure out how to adapt to this new Shaper metagame. Sports Metal had a high cut conversion rate, probably because of the decent matchup into Hoshiko, but when it hit the sea of Shaper, especially the Lat and Arasana list, which were packing Clot, the Sports Metal decks all got eliminated promptly. The top 4 corp decks were all on very different archetypes. Riel won the event playing Personal Evolution, a very asset-heavy build that was a derivative of Loud, a QTM deck for Worlds 23. The deck used Hollow Man along with Cohort Guidance Program to accelerate agenda scores and present a lot of fast advanced threats in addition to Cheki's traditional kill threats. Riel also was playing Kit, and this was the high watermark of kit for the event. Yantuno once again did well with Ob, this time playing an asset-heavy list. It played quite a few new Rebellion Without Rehearsal cards. This deck was enabled mostly by Lu going out of the meta. This archetype would remain good for another few weeks, but as players learned to line against the deck started to perform continually worse. Tuno, however, would continue to put up strong performances on Ob throughout the season. Saka, for the third different corp deck, was playing Asa, that was more or less bread and butter HB with Skunkworks and Analytic Void in a remote server. Historically, this strategy had been best out of Precision Design, but Asa's somewhat higher velocity, along with Tatu Bolo's ability to change the contents of the server during a run, gave the deck seemingly more power than Precision Design. And for the jank lovers out there, Wenjong placed fourth with Issoak, an ID that had seen no competitive play since its release in December of 22. This deck was a twist on the Restoring Humanity kill decks. Instead of playing Regenesis, which was how those decks planned to score out in only 2 agenda scores, this deck played only 5/3s, lowering the agenda density and keeping the punitive threat online for longer. And because of the ID text, the corp still only had to score 2 agendas. This deck applied a lot of hand pressure, which was less common than the high-value ice that the punitive Restoring Humanity decks had historically run, but they would start to pick up some of these cards like Data Loop. This style of ice suite would become more popular, even as Issoak itself did not stick around too much. The following week was the Asia-Pacific Islands Continental Championship. This time, Jai won the event with a Hollow Man Asa list and World Tree Arasana. The Hollow Man Asa deck shared many of the core cards with Sokka's list from the previous week, but more combo lines enabled by the Hollow Man, so the deck was less focused on making an untouchable remote and more on playing a tempo and aggressive game plan. This event, I think, is the one that kind of solidified World Tree Arasana as one of the decks. It had the highest conversion rate out of any deck in the top 16, doubling Ari's presence relative to her percentage of the overall field. One of the interesting things about these Continental Championships is coming out of it, everyone's decided that they showed that Hoshiko was dead. But it's worth pointing out that Hoshiko still makes up a reasonable part of the cuts of both of these events. The corp side was a run back of many of the previous week, though Sports Metal disappeared and many people returned to Precision Design to try and glacier up against the World Tree decks. The EMEA Continental Championship was the third and final Continental held in Bergamo, Italy. 100 players showed up, and the meta evolutions would continue. Hoshiko fell to her lowest presence in any event with an 18% attendance and still the most popular runner. Lat would actually come in second. So despite Kit winning American Continentals and World Tree Arasana winning the one before that, Reg Lat was seen as the most popular ID. The Reg Lat builds started to bifurcate a little bit in how much they were efficiency oriented versus deep dive oriented. The decline in presence of World Tree Arasana is somewhat interesting. My personal theory is that for in-person play, people were more worried about shuffling and going to time with a deck that had to search 1 to 2 times a turn in a 65 card deck and play these very complicated thinky lines. That said, it still took 3 slots out of the top 16, which is a very good conversion for its attendance in the event overall. However, corp side, the big news from the event being EA Sports' Combo Kill Asmari list. This deck used Re-Education along with Jupestod Grid to kill the runners in a single agenda score. This deck did exist as neither of these cards had come out with Rebellion Without Rehearsal. However, Hollow Man changed the game for this deck, along with Sudden Commandment, giving it the ability to beat off-turn card draw for the runners in the form of Stone Ship Chart Room. Even more than World Tree, this deck would consume the Netrunner discourse until Worlds, and with players in camp saying this was a gimmick deck, to players saying, no, this is one of the strongest decks you can run. That said, this deck was played almost exclusively in the United Kingdom and did not achieve widespread success outside of that. I think the jury is kind of still out on how strong the deck was in the 2405 Banlist meta, though I think by the end of as that meta evolved, it became less and less friendly to this Combo Kill Asmari list. Yantuno won the event playing its characteristics decks, Ob and Essa. The Ob was a continued refinement of the list from the American Continentals. The Essa list was a newerish brew. The deck would never achieve widespread uptake, but Yantuno would continue to perform with it throughout the year, and I think it's a stronger deck than its uptake gives credit for. Post-Continentals, the competitive season got incredibly busy with including 3 UK regional, 3 NAMPC events, and 5 nationals that all had player counts north of 30 players. These events, however, did not show any groundbreaking new decks, but lists continued to be refined. The runner side of the table was pretty centralized, with 5 IDs taking up almost the entire set of the card pool, with Lat, Hoshiko, Arasana, Riel, Kit, and Essa taking up over 2/3 of the cut of runners in the top cut, and similar numbers of overall popularity, though Sable was quite popular at about 10% of the field in this period. On the Corp side, though, things looked very different, where over 40% of the field had a less than 5% popularity, and only PD had an over 10% popularity among the field. The top 6 runners covered 85% of the field, so you could know what runner IDs you were likely to hit throughout an event. But the top 6 corps, for comparison, only covered 65% of corps brought to events. What this means is that corps were much more scattered, more reliant on personal preference and local meta calls. Corps posted strong win rates throughout the season, usually between 55 and 60%. When looking at the conversion rates, aka how many players with this ID made it into the top cut relative to how many people showed up with that ID, we see a couple of clear things. One, Shaper is probably the faction to be, placing 3 different IDs with above 1 conversion rates, though Steve takes the cake overall, though with a pretty small sample size similar to Akiko's. We also see that Hoshiko does perform worse than Lat, as does Essa, though I think it's one thing that in particular stands out to me is both Kit and Sable, despite being pretty popular IDs, Kit in fact being the second most popular ID, both converted below their expected percentage of the field, which maybe suggests that they were not well suited to the specific meta that came up. On the Corp side, we see that it's kind of a smorgasbord, which is, what we already knew. PD, the most popular corporation by almost a factor of 3, did convert slightly better. So it was still, despite being the most popular deck, it was one of still the best decks to bring. Though I think Jinteki's strength here really stands out. I want to highlight in particular Ag Infusion. The Ag Infusion decks of this time period, though, were different from the ones early in the year. Early in the year, there had been a lot of punitive Ag Infusion decks. However, in this part of the season, Sokka played a big role in popularizing a more Glacier archetype that swapped the punitive counterstrikes for brands. Another thing to note in this time period was that not that many people were playing World Tree Arasana. Now, maybe this is because the deck was not as strong as I'm piping it up to be, but in general, it seemed like a deck that people didn't feel had basically any natural predators in the Corp. So the reason for World Tree Arasana's low presence is probably due to other factors, and I think they come in threefold. One was it was very skill intensive to pilot, and the next factor was because there was some sense that it was just too good and broke the rules of Netrunner in some fundamental way, that the balance team would act before Worlds, and so it wasn't worth investing the time in learning the deck. And finally, because the deck had to shuffle every turn, it had some real time issues in a lot of formats where people were worried about being in winning board states but being behind on the agenda points when time was called. And at the same time, the toolbox lat decks were proving to be very potent. So even though you weren't playing the best deck by playing toolbox lat, you were playing a deck that could still beat basically every corp with skilled piloting. It notably won both Cascadia and German Nationals, which were events with over 50 attendees. As August started to wind down, players began preparing for Worlds in a big way. To accompany that preparation was the 2409 ban list. The ban list banned a single card, World Tree. The World Tree was to eliminate the deck, even though it was hard to find in events in the preceding weeks before the ban list. The ban list team felt otherwise, that the meta wasn't in a healthy place, wasn't for sure in a healthy place, but it would be difficult to make bigger changes for Worlds, as it would causing significant disruptions would make it very difficult for people to test. Now, the largest event pre-Worlds was Man the Moon's World Showdown, an online event attended by 86 players. And the runner side was a true mix of decks. Arasana, Lat, and Hoshiko and 419 all made up large percentages of the field. On the Corp side, Ag Infusion and Precision Design ended up making half of the top 16, while ASA Group claimed another 3 spots. Both ASA and AgFusion had excellent conversion rates. However, the Kills Mari deck won the whole event, giving its advocates a bit of another piece of ammunition that it had now won events outside of the UK. It's also worth noting that the PD decks that were being played were not the traditional Anagoetic Void Managarm Skunkworks decks, but instead a deck named Moon's PD, because Man in the Moon had claimed the first deck list with it. And this was a Your Digital Life draw-heavy deck that tried to score out its final agendas with Big Deal. This deck had been around and played throughout the year, but in this pre-Worlds push, it was receiving most of the hype as the best way to play Precision Design instead of the Anagoetic Void Managarm Skunkworks version. However, the final event before Worlds, which saw a lat dominance of the top cut, was Rotom Appliance, the former world champion, who showed up with the traditional PD build. All of these events showed that the court meta was still up in the air going into Worlds, and that the event would most likely be won by someone who made the right meta call of how much the field would be Lat, Criminal, and Anarch, and then tune their deck for that. Going into Worlds, the consensus among players I talked to was that Lat was the best deck to play. It had evolved, been refined over the post-Continental season to have a lot of different angles of attack. Its highly efficient breakers allowed it to attack corpse in the early game, and then also make very early and aggressive deep dive plays backed up by Hannah Wheels to close out games pretty quickly. And we would see a couple variations on these control Lats just kind of sweep and clean up at Worlds. Lat was expected to be the deck to beat, but players and testing groups could not come to a consensus on what would beat Lat. On the corp side, no deck exceeded 50% popularity in the field, and Precision Design was the only deck to make up more than 10%. So the corp meta was just wide open. AgFusion, Reality Plus, and Jateki Personal Evolution all accounted for about 10% of the field, whereas Ob and Asmari would hit a pretty low point for them at about 5% representation. It's interesting though, despite Lat having this perceived best deck in format, he only slightly exceeded Hoshiko's popularity, taking up 18% of the field to Hoshiko's 14-ish%. Kit was almost as popular as Hoshiko, with Sable and Essa both taking up another 9% of the field each. So we see that Arasana has disappeared, but the mainstays of the runners for the last several months were pretty much manifested. I think it's particularly interesting just how much of the disparity there was between the sense that Lat was the best deck and how little he was actually brought relative to other periods where we've had when Anarch is the best deck, it tends to take up, we've been seeing Anarch decks make up over half of the field, with almost all those being Hoshiko. And it's actually pretty interesting for Worlds 2024 that the faction balance was 38% of the players brought Shaper, 35% of the players brought Anarch, and 25% of the players brought Criminal. So there was actually a reasonable balance between the three factions, though Criminal was definitely suffering. After 2 days and 14 grueling rounds of Swiss, the top 16 showed a runner composition that was pretty much expected, but a very unique and different corp side. Lat went from 18% of the field to 50% of the top 16. And Arasana, despite not making it onto my pie charts, put 2 players in the top 16. The Hoshiko players, however, suffered significantly, with only 2 of them making it into the top cut. This is most likely because the 2 most popular decks in the top 16, Ace and R+, were combining high-tempo game plans with gear check ice that the Hoshiko decks were less well-equipped to handle than the Shaper decks were. Ace's resurgence was powered by 2 different archetypes. So Jai, as well as a few other top 16 players, continued to play aggressive Hollow Man decks, tweaked to try and tax out Lat's credit pool more so than previous versions. And because most of the Shaper decks at this point had cut Clot, they started to add Biotic Labors to give the deck some fast advance outs to Shaper endgame board states. Logic Bomb, a new testing group, made a big splash with their Jukebox Asa, which made the deck into more combo lines than the Hollow Man versions, combining MCA Austerity Policy and Audacity to provide lots of different creative scoring lines and tax out the credit pool of runners more extensively. Asset-based Reality Plus decks also became one of the decks of the format, though many of the decks in the top 32 in Reality Plus started including what I would call kind of cheesy win conditions in the form of Public Trail and End of the Line. These are not like robust, consistent game plans, but they were a way to leverage and try and buy early game tempo against these lat and aggressive shaper decks. Ag Infusion also made up a big splash in this top 32, being a quarter of the top 16 and finishing in 3rd and 4th place. PE made up 10% of the top 32 and finished a very strong 2nd in its final World Championship, piloted by Deer. This deck combined some of the hand stress cards seen from Iswak and many of the kill combo lines from Yale's deck back in Continentals to provide the runner a plethora of ways to mess up, as well as the deck having a lot of different fast advance and scoring options. While that was the most represented deck in the top cut, Arizan won the event with Arisana. The deck was pretty different than most shaper decks in the format. Instead of playing a heavy control game, this was more of a combo deck. The deck still had some classics, like the obligatory 3 copies of Trick Shot, but it included the up until now unnoticed card Spree. It used Spree along with Botulists that has been sitting on the board for multiple turns, as well as Pichasau to enable explosive combo deep dives that could play 2 or 3 deep dives in a single turn. Ar's only been playing variations of this list since Rebellion's Rehearsal's release. It placed it in the top cut at several events, but it had not been picked up by the wider player base. On the Corpse side, Arizan was playing one of these asset-heavy kill optionality R+ decks that sought to outspeed the Lats in setting up an early game board state and keep them off their top tempo. I've talked somewhat about the Corp win rates throughout the year, and here on this plot you can see Corp win rates as a whole averaged over 50%. I want to thank Kikai of the Surveyor blog for collecting and compiling a lot of this data. He's been a huge help throughout this process. What we see at the World Championship, though, is that the top player consensus that this was a runner meta started to match up with reality. What we can see here is that Lat took a 60% win rate in games he played, and Arasana was not far behind. So while Corpse would have a slight edge in overall win rate, this seems more due to people not playing Lat, as UK Nats, the final event I'm going to cover, demonstrates well. The final event of the season, or at least that I'll talk about in this video, was the UK Nationals, held 1 month after the World Championship. Few players believe that Lat was anything but the best deck on the runner side, and UK Nationals was Lat's high watermark in terms of percentage of the field, going to 31%. Arizan's Arizona list, despite having won Worlds, was not really picked up, with an eighth of the field instead opting for Kit and another 11% for Essa and 10% for Sable. On the Corp side, despite PD only a single PD making the top 16 at Worlds, it was the most popular deck on the Corp side again. However, Reality Plus would be right on its heels in terms of presence, and the Reality Plus decks here would move away from kill combos and back towards more of the early season bounce tools to reset other board states. Reality Plus would dominate the cut at UK Nationals, though both OB and PE would take up very respectable percentages. 3 different styles of OB decks made the cut, and this was probably one of the best events for OB all year, including combo kill, rush, and asset heavy versions. Asa, despite being very popular at Worlds, was not a popular deck for people brought to UK Nationals, but it did end up winning the event along with Lat, making it his biggest win of his most dominant season so far. So that was the 2024 Netrunner meta. Despite Corpse having a higher win rate throughout the year, with runners only catching up in the waning months, it felt like a meta that was driven entirely by the runner side of the table. From Mulch to World Tree to the Control Lat, runners were dominant for the ability to respond to Corp lists and bust basically any conventional scoring remote. It generally felt like, as the Corp, you needed to have the runner make a mistake. And so a lot of Corp decks were designed not to have a game plan that could kind of brute force wins, but instead provide runners with many opportunities to make mistakes. However, the 24-12 ban list hit Trick Shot, Reality Plus, and Luminal, so it's pretty clear that 2025 has started in a different direction. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but I will probably try and do a quick, a less scripted, more hot take video about my thoughts on the 24-12 ban list, why I'm not a huge fan of it, and how the meta has started to evolve post this ban list. I want to say thank you to everyone for watching, and if you somehow made it all the way to the end, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Apologies for this video taking so long. There's been rumors of this going around for a bit. In early December, I became a dad. This video kind of sat on the back burner for a little bit. So I want to thank everyone for their patience, and hope that everyone has had a good new year so far. This video has been a lot of work, and it would not have been possible without a bunch of great community resources such as Always Be Running, Kikai's blog, and a bunch of people just chatting with me throughout the year. And if you want to look at any of these events in much more detail than I could cover in this video, I would definitely recommend going to the Surveyor and reading up on the event. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's things you wish I had talked about or would like me to talk about more next time I make something like this, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. And I look forward to seeing what this year of the new OP structure and elevation will have for Netrunner, in particular the competitive season. And hopefully you'll hear from me all before too long. Thanks for watching, everyone.